Hi, everyone. Welcome to this session as part of the Africa and Middle East Regional Roundtable. I'm David Carlin. I am the lead for the TCFD and climate risk programs for UNEP FI. I'm really glad to be here with you for this session and look forward to discussing some of the important recent developments around climate risk and climate disclosures with you, as well as some of the helpful ways that UNEP FI's pilot programs have produced resources that you can take advantage of as public goods to help in your disclosure and risk management journey. To begin with, to provide a little bit of background on the work, what is the TCFD? The TCFD is the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and essentially it was set up back in 2015 by the Financial Stability Board, a group chaired by Michael Bloomberg and the former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, with a desire to help financial markets better understand the climate risks that companies faced. And by the way that they did this was by putting together 4 pillars on relevant areas that can be impacted by climate. So looking at governance, what is the governance around climate? Strategies, what strategies will one take to manage climate risks, take advantage of climate opportunities? The actual risk management itself, what are those processes? And then finally, the metrics and targets. And within those 4 disclosures are 11 suggested disclosures as well that the TCFD has laid out for good practice. So you can see them here on this page. A number of them look at what practices your institution is following around integrating climate risk disclosure information into your operations. Some of them look at what metrics you're using to report on the scale of your climate risk, as well as the actions you're taking around emissions in your portfolio. And others still refer to the specific risk processes that you have in place in order to ensure that there is adequate balance of climate risks and opportunities within your portfolio. So with that introduction, I'm really glad to have my colleague Maheen talk about some of the latest developments for climate risk. And this has been a really fast-moving space, so she'll cover a few of those major developments, and I'll add in a few thoughts as well later on. But we look forward to going through this session with you and taking the questions that you have as we discuss these timely topics. Thank you.
Hi everyone, I'm Maheen and I work with the TCFD's Phase 3 program. My work mainly focuses on stress testing, and today me and my colleague will be discussing the latest developments in climate risk, as well as talk about our program. So just a quick overview about today's session. We will first discuss the latest climate risk developments and then go into UNEP FI's climate risk resources and programs on the TCFD. So to begin with, I'm going to talk about the newly released Phase 2 of the Ngfs climate scenarios. So earlier this month, Ngfs released a new set of climate scenarios, which are a more improved version of Phase 1 of their scenarios, and these scenarios have really been incorporated to be brought up to date and to include all relevant climate risk developments that have taken place recently. These scenarios do also consider economic implications of physical and transition risk, as well as NGF has made a larger range of variables available and for a greater number of countries, increasing regional granularity. So the previous phase of the NGFS had 8 scenarios. The new phase launched a set of 6 scenarios. They still fit within the standard NGFS scenario framework, which you can see on the right-hand side. So as you can see, they have high and low transition risk, and as well as high and low physical risk on the other side, with the 4 standard categories being orderly transition, disorderly transition, hot house world, as well as the too little too late scenario. So these 6 scenarios mainly fit into the orderly, disorderly, and the hot house world scenarios. The first one I like to mention is the net zero by 2050 scenario, which includes the implementation of policies as well as carbon taxes, which will allow the world to be set on a 1.5-degree pathway by 2050. So in this scenario, basically, all regions and all sectors implement the policies needed to reach net zero emissions by 2050. Then there is the below 2 degrees orderly scenario, in which there is a implementation of policies to help limit global warming by below 2 degrees. This set of policies are expected to gradually increase with time. The third scenario is a divergent net zero 1.5 degree scenario, which is also similar to the net zero 2050. It is the implementation of policies and taxes to reach 1.5 degrees and net zero emissions by 2050. However, the implementation of policies is fragmented and is not standard across all countries and all regions, as well as sectors. Then there is a delayed transition, in which policy implementation to reduce global emissions does not occur until 2030, which results in the implementation of more stringent and abrupt policies to help limit warming below 2 degrees. Then there are the hothouse world scenarios, which are your NDCs. So these include pledges made by countries, even those that have not yet been implemented, as well as current policies, which suggest that no new policies are going to be introduced to limit global emissions. So it only includes the currently implemented policies. So this slide shows the changes that have been brought to the NGFS scenarios from phase 1 to phase 2. As I mentioned before, these scenarios have been brought more up to date to include the recent implementation of policies by regions across the world. These also now include a macroeconomic model to understand the economic implications. So these scenarios then can be used to determine the impact on GDP, inflation, as well as the unemployment rate. And as I mentioned before, that the NGFS has made thousands of new variables available, and they've allowed the downscaling of regions, so scenario analysis can occur for individual countries. So this table shows the main changes in the scenarios, and the two main changes I'd like to highlight is the introduction of a net zero by 2050 scenario, which then includes regional policies that are going to be implemented to reach net zero emissions. And the second main change that has occurred is these new set of scenarios have reduced their reliance on CDR. So the second development that has recently occurred is the Bank of England's Climate Biennial Exploratory Scenario. So it is their climate stress testing exercise. So earlier this month, they released their key elements of this exploratory scenario exercise. The climate stress test will have three main objectives. One is to size the financial exposures of financial institutions, as well as the financial system as a whole to climate risk, which will include both transition and physical risk. The second objective is to understand the implications of these climate risks, as well as their impact on business models of financial institutions, as well as then to understand the challenges these institutions will face. And then the third objective is to assist financial institutions in their risk management to manage the exposure of these risks, as well as to understand the vulnerabilities of their counterparties. So the exercise itself is going to focus on credit risk, but the Bank of England has specified that this is only a learning exercise, and the results of this exercise will not be used to set any new capital requirements. So a few features I'd like to go over for this climate stress test are that, first of all the largest UK banks and insurers are going to be taking part in this. The exercise is going to look at three scenarios, which I will explain in greater detail on the next slide, but they will include both transition and physical risk, which will then span over a time horizon of 30 years, which is much longer than a typical stress test. As well as I mentioned, that the results of the stress test are not going to be used for capital requirements. So it's more of a learning exercise to understand what vulnerabilities does the financial institution as well as the financial system as a whole will be facing from these climate risks. The expected results, the expected date for these results to be released is June 2022. But the Bank of England has also announced that they might be doing a second round in January of 2022. So I'm just going to go over these scenarios for the exercise really quickly. So these scenarios were built upon the Ngfs scenarios. So there are three main scenarios, which are the early action, late action, and no additional action scenarios. This diagram provides a very quick overview on the transition risk and the physical risks that are going to be looked at with each scenario. So similar to the Ngfs scenarios, the early action is the implementation of policies starting from 2021, and they will gradually increase to help limit global temperature rise by 1.8 degrees. The late action scenario is that no policies are introduced until 2031 to reduce global emissions to limit the global temperature rise to 1.8 degrees. And the no additional action scenario is where no new policies are introduced, which will, even though it result to low transition risk, the physical risks are still going to be pretty high. I would like to really quickly explain how these scenarios differ from the Ngfs scenarios. So these scenarios have been modified from the standard Ngfs scenarios in a few ways. One being that they include localized physical risks, and they also consider policies that have been announced by the UK government, as well as they also include greater transmission channels to incorporate greater macroeconomic implications. Now I'd like to hand this over to my colleague, David, who leads our TCFD program.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction, Maheen. And just as a little introduction to myself, I'm David Carlin. I lead the TCFD and climate risk programming for UNEP FI, and I'm really glad to be here with you today to talk a bit about some of these other emerging developments. I think also perhaps it's useful to do a little bit of term definition. So I'll go through that and just mention, as we see on this page, a few things. The first is in the graphic itself, TCFD. So the TCFD relates to what Maheen was talking about, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. That was originally created in 2017, and the idea of the TCFD was in order to provide specific guidance around financial disclosures for institutions. And it is a voluntary initiative of the financial sector as well as the real economy to commit to making disclosures, so climate-related financial disclosures in particular, and providing guidance on those. So another question would be around negative emissions technologies that you heard mentioned for some of those scenarios. So CDR is typically a shorthand for negative emissions because it stands for carbon dioxide removal. So whenever you're hearing about more CDR being used, you can think of more negative emissions. You also see GHG for greenhouse gases, referring not only to carbon dioxide, CO2, but also to other greenhouse gases like methane and nitrous oxide, as well as some less commonly found greenhouse gases. I would also just mention that the Bank of England, as discussed in their stress testing, every year they hold a a stress test and also a new scenario considering something somewhat different. That new scenario is called the biennial exploratory scenario because they do it every 2 years. And the reason that it's called CBES in this case is because it's the climate biennial exploratory scenario. So just a little bit of term definition for us as we go on in this discussion and talk about a couple of the other developments specifically related to this, this latest release from that group, that task force on climate-related financial disclosures. And so just to mention, in addition to the new scenarios and the new stress testing announced, there's also been new guidance around disclosure. And so this is specifically what we're covering here when it comes to these disclosures. And so ultimately, the goal was to make the disclosures more quantitative and to give better guidance to institutions on what they should do. So even if, for example, they lacked a regulatory demand or a requirement to make a disclosure, this can be a framework and format that they're able to follow in doing so. And if we go to the next page, we can see a little bit more about the latest developments from the TCFD. Which is to say that in their recent guidance, the TCFD has issued a set of principles that helps with target setting, so that work around getting to net zero emissions by 2050, meaning essentially that carbon dioxide emissions, however much are being emitted in 2050, are equally or more than equally offset by negative emissions, so actions that are taking carbon out of the atmosphere, so planting trees, using mechanical technologies to do this, but ultimately that we get to that net zero balance. So uniquely for the TCFD, it had mostly focused on climate risk. Now we see additional guidance, and that additional guidance looking at how institutions can make transition plans, what are the steps required to make those transition plans, as well as what they should think about in terms of targets. The TCFD hasn't gone as far as some of the UNEP initiatives, such as the Asset Owner Alliance or the Net Zero Banking Alliance, on laying out the specifics of what these targets should look like, but they aim to provide broad principles that also are in line with those laid out by the UNEP initiative. So that is to use recognized metrics, to be sufficiently granular, to be backed by science, and to provide interim targets on the way to that net zero goal. So if we go to the next page, I'll talk a little bit more about a disclosure-related piece before circling back for some questions that we have. So the G7, the group of 7 of the advanced democracies, largely in North America and Western Europe, plus Japan, got together for their summit. And in the UK earlier this month, and in June, or sorry, earlier this month, discussed the movement on climate action and the recognition that climate action needs to occur. And you can see in the agreed upon language from the outputs of that meeting that they support moving toward mandatory climate-related financial disclosures based on the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. So what that means is the expectation from those G7 nations is that regulation and guidance will align to the TCFD, and that the expectation has been set that institutions that do business in these countries will make these types of disclosures in order to provide both comparable and standardized information for stakeholders, including the public, including regulators, as well as investors and internal decision makers. And so work is still ongoing around the development of better disclosure practices. Work is still ongoing around the development of reporting and specific standards, but that work is well underway, and we expect over the next few months to see a greater number of countries not only acknowledging support for the TCFD, but actually making climate disclosures required, as the UK and New Zealand and a number of other institutions have done either now or on a phased-in basis. So let me stop there, just to go to the next page once more, going one page forward. Just to kind of sum these pieces up, really to say, across all of these developments, the new scenarios, the stress testing, the further guidance, the support for disclosure, we're really seeing an accelerating trend of regulatory interest in this topic, as well as a broadening of the tools, as well as the expectations for financial institutions in measuring and managing and disclosing their climate risks. And so by having these more granular outputs and information, not only will stakeholders be better equipped to understand the climate risks faced, but institutions themselves can better incorporate the risks and opportunities of climate into their strategies. And so further than that, what I would say is we're seeing greater convergence at the international level. We're seeing a recognition that imminently better and more aligned standards are necessary. And we're seeing greater expectation and greater energy put into the quantification of these particular risks, of these particular targets. So this sort of era of the soft commitment is over, and the expectation is that commitments that are made are not only kept, but are also tied directly to activities that that are practiced and are material for the institutions. So let me stop there, as I said, and just take a few of the questions that I've seen from the group. So a few on some items. One is around how this relates back to the roundtable for Africa and the Middle East. And I would say in a lot of ways, this is the wave of the future. These are developments and disclosures that occur in markets where companies from Africa and the Middle East trade, do business, especially for resource-rich countries. This, to my mind, signals a real consideration and need to consider what are the transition risks as economies move away from certain fossil fuels, certain emitting activities. What is that actually going to mean for institutions? And so using the tools and guidance to not only recognize that you will need to meet future regulatory requirements, even if they don't yet exist, but also in order to be seen by investors and stakeholders as credibly addressing the climate challenge. So that's I think one of the big questions, is its application and applicability has become more relevant as it becomes more of a global trend. We also see within the new scenarios from NGFS a lot of regional downscaling. Regional downscaling means getting into the specific details for particular companies, or sorry, for particular countries in terms of their emissions, their outputs. And in a lot of ways that can help solve some of the data gaps that have existed in places like Africa and the Middle East in terms of reporting. And so by having these scenarios, you have a better way of strategizing and understanding how these things will unfold, not just at a global level, but within a given country. The next question was around the specifics of addressing climate risks, even if there aren't explicit regulatory requirements. I think, as you saw from the G7 communique, and I think what you're likely to see ahead of the Conference of Parties in November of this year, is more and more countries signing on to make these explicit regulatory requirements. But even for countries that haven't done that yet, there is support for the TCFD and for the standards and guidance that it provides. And what that means is, for institutions, they can begin using the TCFD as a structure, even if they don't have the reporting mandate required of them. But it still provides a very useful way of understanding what the specific risks are and how they might be dealt with. Another question is related to that topic of net zero, and asking, is net zero the same as carbon offsetting? And I think that that's a really good question, because carbon offsetting can be seen similarly as net zero. typically when we use these terms, when we refer to net zero, we usually are referring to it in the larger sense of getting net emissions to zero for the globe, for a country, for a company, whereas carbon offsetting can refer more discretely to a specific action that reduces emissions, that offsets a particular activity. So one is more structural, whereas the other is more activity driven. That said, one of the ways to reach net zero may be to use offsets. One of the big skepticisms is how those offsets are accounted for and whether there are risks that there's either double counting or improper accounting. So what sounds like net zero maybe isn't really net zero. And so carbon offsets can be a way of getting to net zero. They don't necessarily need to be. They're also big parts of getting to net zero are big reductions in the overall use of emitting fuels, emitting activities, but also potentially the use of offsets or of negative emissions technologies to reduce those emissions. So I think that was the set of questions on the current developments that we've gotten. So thanks a lot for asking those. And as a related point, because things are moving so fast, if we go to the next page, we'll get into the second part of our presentation, which is really around climate risk resources. And so specifically, UNEP FI over the last 4 years has developed a host of resources that should be valuable and available in an open source way for any of the regional roundtable participants who are UNEP FI members. And so we'll talk about this because of that rate of change in the regulatory space, in the expectations. These are good tools, hopefully, to get you up to speed, as well as updates on our programs and how those have come to provide value. So if we go to the next page, you can see a large number of global banks have participated in our TCFD pilots since 2017. This is an overview of those that participated in the last phase. As you can see, there's Access Bank from Nigeria, as well as a number of banks from from South Africa, including Nedbank, also Standard Bank, First Rand, and so you can see, and ABSA as well. So you can see some of the large regional or continental players represented here. If we go to the next page, we'll rewind a little bit back to where the program started and in that way discuss some of the resources generated. So the initial work began in 2017 after that first consultation from the TCFD, where they discussed how to release climate relevant financial information. And so we worked with a couple consultancies, Oliver Wyman and Acclimatize, in order to develop a reliable approach for both measuring the physical as well as transition risks of the of a given portfolio. And the goal there was to allow comparability across a number of institutions and to allow adaptability to different sectors as well as regions. And the hope and desire was to implement this information into the recommendations of the TCFD. And so when institutions made their disclosures, to use this as a form to do that. If we go to the next page, we'll talk a little bit about the most recent completed pilot for banks, which was around exploring climate scenarios. So as Maheen talked about at the beginning, understanding those particular scenarios and how they have changed and evolved with greater refinement, greater detail, new assumptions, and looking at what those scenarios mean both for the physical as well as transition risks. And one of the big goals is had been to give institutions access to a large number of new scenarios, new perspectives in order to run their analyses. And so that was accomplished through collaboration with climate modelers, such as those from the Potsdam Institute, as well as the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis. On a related note, we looked at data and aimed to refine and develop our methodologies for for sectoral assessment. In the pilot phase that I mentioned previously, those were really just simply covering a few major sectors. Here, what we did was we aimed to deploy the approach to a wider range of sectors, as well as discuss what the data needs were and where the data gaps existed. Finally, on the reporting and governance, how to make this part of a good disclosure, we talked about that it wasn't just enough to report on these activities, but that they must be integrated into your governance. So how do we make decisions around risk, on risk management, without having the adequate information? Well, it's not particularly easy. So in doing so, I think we have a real need and real desire in order to enhance that reporting, both in standardizing the disclosures, but also in confirming and asserting that the activities and policies and procedures that are done throughout organizations to manage climate risks are reflected in those reports. And from that work, we produced a number of outputs that we hope are useful both for the industry at large as well as for your individual institution. So if we go to the next page, we can see a few of those inputs. And specifically, I would cover on the physical risk side, we developed a blueprint for the assessment of physical risk and also specific strategies for looking at transitions and looking at opportunities and understanding how those opportunities themselves can be produced. We also developed, from our methodology from phase one, a web tool for assessing transition risk with Oliver Wyman. And we wrote a few papers both on heat mapping as well as exploration of new sectors. As I talked about previously, we also looked at governance and the application of climate risk to risk frameworks themselves. We also put together a number of reports on climate scenarios and good practices on disclosure. One with the IAF we put together on disclosure, and I'll talk a little bit, if we go to the next page, on some that we developed on both managing climate risks as well as making scenarios more understandable of the financial sector. So as I said, one of the goals was to help institutions manage climate risk. Another was to look at scenarios with a set of climate experts from the group known as Cicero out of Oslo, and also to look at an impact on disorderly transitions. So what were those disorderly transitions and what did they end up looking like across different sectors? So if there were rapid changes in a sector, what could that mean and how could that happen based on current climate scenarios? Finally, we did an overview of the existing tools and existing data providers, which we're working to build into a database that is repeatedly updated. So if we pause there, I'll talk a little bit about some of the questions we've received and then hand it back over to Maheen to talk about our next pilot. But in a couple of the questions that I've seen on this material, right now we're in the midst of another pilot for banks as well as investors. We have some from Africa and the Middle East involved in that, but we also, I wanted to mention, with UNDP's climate SDG facility, put on a series of sessions for North African and Middle Eastern banks doing workshops around the TCFD. And it's our hope to build out in the future more regionalized TCFD pilots. So I would look for, in early 2022, plans to have regional pilots where we can specifically lead institutions such as those from this region in meeting some of their climate risk and climate disclosure goals. Finally, one of the biggest challenges is around data, and I know especially in this region, there's a number of challenges that come up around getting adequate data from clients, getting adequate risk data, and recognizing that data itself is a challenge, but not an excuse. As we are risk managers, we need to think about how we understand the risks in light of imperfect information. And given that we may lack that, that full information, how do we deal with that? And the short answer to that is we need to think about what are alternative sources. So in our climate risk landscape, we look at some of the open source data. We also are currently undertaking that through a extension of that landscape review with a number of providers and helping institutions do demos of those tools to see which ones are open source and what the coverage is of those open source tools. So there are open source tools. There's also the option and long-term goal of building some of these capabilities internally. So between all of those, I think that there's a number of paths forward, even in the face of limited data. So I think that was the set of questions I've seen. I'm really glad to hand it now back to Maheen to talk a little bit about our latest work on the next page around the TCFD and the work we're doing with banks and investors. So I'll stop things here and hand off to her.
Thanks. So as David mentioned, we're currently in our phase 3 of our TCFD program, which began earlier this year. So phase 3 builds upon the work of the phase 1 and the phase 2 pilot programs, in which we help banks and investors identify and assess their climate risks, as well as help build capacity for incorporating those climate risks into their climate-related financial disclosures. So phase 3 includes 49 global banks and investors participating from different regions around the world. This also includes financial institutions from Africa and the Middle East. So our phase 3 program has been divided into 8 different modules, which themselves could be considered mini programs. And each module has its own set of activities and as well as its own set of outputs, which participants have the opportunity of contributing in. We've also partnered with a number of different international institutions to help conduct work in these modules. So I'll just quickly go over the modules that we've been working on during our current program. So we had a set of 4 modules begin earlier this year, and then we had a set of other 4 modules follow through in the second quarter of the year. So currently, we're conducting a module on sectoral climate risk, which looks at the different climate risks faced by sectors such as oil and gas, mining and metals, industrials, transportation, agriculture. We also have a landscape review model looking at different tools available for financial institutions to assess physical and transition risks. We've also partnered with CREM on assessing transition risk for the real estate sector for financial institutions. And we also have a module on climate stress testing, which looks at how does climate stress testing differ from traditional stress testing, as well as looking at what are the best practices for conducting a climate stress test, as well as looking into the scenario analysis required. Then we also have ongoing work on the economic impacts of climate change, which looks at different physical and transition impacts of climate change, and we've partnered with a number of institutions to conduct work on that using different tools. We have current work on climate risk management and disclosure, as well as how financial institutions can support climate transitions into decarbonization. And we've partnered with the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership for that module, as well as we're conducting work on portfolio implied temperatures and how banks and investors can conduct target setting and then incorporate those into their climate-related financial disclosures. Along with our modules, we also have roadmap sessions, which are there to help financial institutions build capacity as they progress on their TCFD journey. So as you can see on this slide, our roadmap is divided into 5 stages to help financial institutions build up their knowledge on climate disclosures as well as climate risk. So we began with holding sessions on climate risk, introducing the importance of those and how they impact the financial system, which was then led to our second part of our roadmap sessions, which was climate risk identification, so identifying both physical and transition risk. Then we've looked at climate risk assessment. So as David mentioned, the biggest limitation of climate risk assessment is the limitation of climate data. So we've looked at different climate data as well as different methodologies. We are now currently in our fourth phase, which is looking at TCFD reporting as well as climate regulations. And we plan to further go into details and provide in-depth sessions on climate risk management. And I'm going to hand it over back to David for any closing remarks on our program.
Hi, so thanks again, Maheen, and really great to again be here with you at this roundtable session. And I just wanted to thank you all for your attention and let you know if you do have any questions that you'd like us to address or more specific follow-ups, please don't hesitate to reach out. Our emails are just first.last@un.org. So in my case, david.carlin@un.org. And we'll be very much looking forward to following up and continuing the conversation with you. Thanks.